Absolutely.
Hello, Daniel.
Oh, Matthew, how are you doing? This is a thrill.
Likewise, the so with your permission, I would like to put this on my channel. And
Please.
I I'm fine with the silences and the pauses and the searchings. And as I was walking today on a sidewalk, I thought to myself, I've watched your videos. I've scrolled through your website and I've listened to some of your conversations. And I see in us 2 pages of a book where the mystery is the binding.
Mm.
And here on the internet, two worlds coming closer together. And what I mean by two Jupiters is there's so much impenetrable, subtle matter, which is the buildup of reading different philosophers and books and literatures, and in your case, writing many books, which are available on Amazon, I'm aware. Now, there is an eye, Jupiter, there is an opening, but we are capturing, we are nevertheless capturing that first encounter now. And my planet doesn't just open up. I can't make it happen. And I don't know phenomenologically how you're experiencing this meeting of two people who like to read now without a script. We didn't discuss what we would discuss except for a title with the word Meno in it, which is a Socratic dialogue. But what comes to mind? And we'll go somewhere.
Well, first off, what comes to mind is the importance to be willing to jump into things without a script and with the possibility of what might unfold. I actually, a lot of people talk about it could be Robert Putnam and Bowling Alone, or that book Lost Connections, that kind of talk about like the pulling apart of people not having friends, not having community. They don't do Lions Club and different things. And I think actually part of that is tied to the awkwardness of that first encounter, that you would think that we would be over with all of the social media, with all of the connections and associations. But the issue is, I think a lot of people's encounters are kind of mediated by institutions and communities in school. Oh, we're all in school, that's why we meet. Oh, we're all on Facebook, that's why we meet. And there's a kind of indirectness to encounter that then actually, when it comes to diving in and meeting people on an pre-mediated space, for example, you're meeting at work because you all are working to make money. Oh, you're meeting at school. Well, then there is that unknown that is very strange and foreign. And so people can resist that. But if you resist that, then all of your relationships are basically at the mercy of the spaces that are given to you by the society, by the workspace, by the school. And then one day it turns out that it stops providing those things for you. And then you find yourself part of that loss of social connection, part of, loss of community, so on and so forth. I mean, you even see like where people that go to church who tend to have better social interactions, they may just meet on Sunday and then not go beyond that because they're so used to just having the institution do the mediation of those encounters. So I think part of the willingness to just dive in outside of maybe a social script or an institutional pre-stage is one of the necessary things that comes for the human being to actually open new horizons or to encounter new possibilities or to have those planets come in contact. And if we only meet people or speak to people when we know what we're going to say or we know how the opening is there, well, then how do we ever know when the opening is there, right? You have to, an opening has to, it almost has to be like you have to take the risk that that's almost the necessary space for the possibility of the opening. Or what's happening is you're letting the opening actually be external from you in the system or the institution that feels like an openness, but actually it's external to you. It's not really that true, deeper openness, but it feels that way. So that the first thing that just comes to mind, which then may even speak to Meno, because it's like that risk of virtue. Like, what is virtue if we don't know what it is? Let's take a shot at what we think is virtuous. Let's try to recall it, even if we don't know what it is. I think it's connected, and it's interesting to me because I do think about things like friendship, virtue,
beauty, meaning, all of these things seem to be connected in this kind of apprehension that is a result of not knowing how you're going to apprehend ahead of time. And yet, precisely because you take that risk, something can occur.
With that said, I will ask for your trust that I milestoned what you said and I'm responding to the totality of my impression to it. And as I work through, I will make references to some of those key points, not necessarily in order.
Absolutely.
But dialogue is not a game of summaries and paraphrases. So here we go. With the bowling alone, 7-10 split. This is a call to action from within a frame, mediated by that greased floor or ungreased floor, depending on whether or not I have the eye to see where it has been. And also that knowledge is telling of how often I have been there. If I know who places the oil, and if I know whether or not to care about these facts and not all the facts in the universe as I stand before this 7-10 split. But everything I said, all the elements thereof, is interchangeable with someone in Silicon Valley looking at a screen, figuring out how to program some little minute part of Google Map. So here we have, I think, finite infinite game territory. Because what is the 7-10 split, if I could bridge a metaphor? What is the 7-10 split in terms of distance for the risk-taking you're evoking in me with what you said and how you said it? In those social releases, in those social, often we experience this in conversation, there's a coming back around within itself while going forward until there is a moment when we find out, oh, we have hit a gutter and this is now only going one way. This is when some people check out, knowing the gutter or the end of the lane in the gutter is a foregone conclusion. But what is gained, what is lost by actually going for the 7-10 split? By, as it were, using the distance infinitely for the finite score. Now, in Meno, with that double knowledge, which is a kind of genus-species relationship, the proof of the acquiring of a virtue, because one could ask, is the virtue a Platonic umbrella up, keeping us from irrelevancies? All the atomic facts that Wittgenstein could talk about with his formulae? Or is the virtue something concrete that is, to use a phrase from Cormac McCarthy, in the autistic dark of universals? But I'm not trying to do a word game here. Is it a genus or a species? A virtue. A virtue. I'm already giving my hand away. Do we speak the virtue, a virtue?
Well, I love everything that you're saying. So there's a few things
That comes to mind. Is first, it's interesting because I would say that often if we rely, say, on institutions for our relations, one day they can actually turn into a gutter. And actually, you don't know how to get out of the gutter, but it just is carrying you along. And one day you find out you've been in the gutter for years. And that actually can happen to a lot of people. So, for example, they've been in a job for 30 years. They have, oh, I know this person, I knew that person. And then they retire. And then they don't see that person anymore. They just kind of vanish. But because you had that sort of daily interaction, you didn't have the realization that once that superstructure, if you will, that structure, that routine was pulled away, the relationship would go with it. So it turned out that you were just being carried along in the gutter the entire time, as opposed to staying on a lane of something that was actually a result of maybe a skill of the throw or a skill of your ability to stay on the slide. And it would seem also, too, that the funny thing is that once you do that, once you make that mistake, you can actually get out of the habit of realizing the difference between the gutter and the lane, of realizing how to stay on the lane. So you can lose that. And what's very interesting is, I think, on the question of, is virtue like a virtue or the virtue? What's interesting is that it's almost like what Plato wants to suggest is that, one, you could say, you know it when you see it, boom, there it is. That's a virtue, that's participating in the virtue. And yet you have to be in it to know it. This is what's very curious, because this question of, can you teach virtue? So for example, you know the difference between a relationship that's just a product of the shared work environment and the difference between a relationship that's something more than that when you see it. You know it when you're in the difference is the quality, right? You actually may spend more time with the person at work than you do the person who you have a deeper friendship with, and yet you know the difference because of terms of quality, right? So there's also a kind of like, what's the difference if I say, like, it seems kind of, oh, of course you can teach virtue. Don't kill people. Okay, now you know virtue, right? And yet it's funny because that's not what they're talking about. Like, I can give you a sort of principle, but the quality of that principle is very, very different than coming along and seeing a man on the side of the road that you need to help, like in the Good Samaritan story, right? Mm-hmm. There's something entirely different between the quality of the experience, between the don't kill someone and the seeing someone and apprehending that that's my neighbor and I need to help him. That makes me think of kind of Ivan Illich. So it's interesting because the idea of like, do unto others what you would want done to yourself, that's kind of a general kind of virtue, that's the right thing. And yet without that particular manifestation of a expression, a example, a situation of the person on the side of the road, it's meaningless. And yet once you do it, then you feel that it's participating in something larger than itself. And then it's gone outside the situation. It kind of leaps up in the act and then it's not there. But if you try to leap down from the principle, that seems to be the problem, because you're trying to fit it into your own ideas of who the neighbor is and what you're supposed to do. And unfortunately, very often that tends to be people like us, right? My neighbor just happens to have the same belief and the same ideas and so on and so forth. So I'll take the treat others like I want to be treated as someone like me. And that's when then the principle that's supposedly a virtue actually can be self-serving. But if it's the guy on the side of the road who I don't know, who actually may have political beliefs different from me or different ideas, or I don't even like, and I apprehend that that's my neighbor and that's who I need to help, then that leaps up into something more universal, as opposed to leaping down from something universal. In the same way that if you stay, and then I'll give it back to you, if you stay on the bowling lane, that very act then leaps up into a sort of principle of, oh, this is the quality of a real relationship in this particular example of staying on the bowling lane. But then what's funny is it's almost like you have to be on the bowling lane to know that you're part of that more universal principle. But the problem is, it's almost the horror that if you're in the gutter, you also lose the connection with that universal principle to know you're in the gutter. So it's interesting that in the principle, you get the universal, but if you lose it, you lose both. So I think that distinction you brought up is very interesting.
Wow. As I said, we can take our time because pauses are not foreign on my channel.
That's a good thing. Pauses are a good thing.
Obviously, we're using the lane and the pins and the ball and the release and the apprehension and the risk in a metaleptic, by which I mean these words can be interchangeable for other words. And as we synoptically talk, that is, we talk around the thing we're trying to, it's not the philosophers with their hands on different parts of the elephant, but as we're with language reasoning around, we find that whatever the around that we're reasoning to is expanding, which pushes us to a limit and actually pushes us beyond limits, which educates us about things around the discourse or the subject or the target. All right. Now, I will come to your word apprehension, but with that said about the transferable terms, as we synoptically talk about these things, notice when the ball ends up in the gutter and moves towards the end of the lane as a foregone conclusion. It's moving parallel to what could have been. It doesn't disappear. And I think that has an analogous framing in discussions about being and non-being, and the privation of the latter as partial and not absolute. And I bring this up because I've heard you speak of presence and absence, and I'm intrigued by how you will say things like explanation is not an address, using that binary of presence absence, with which now I want to introduce the conceptual term, which I think is a paradigmatic term, one of those terms that as you open the bulletin in the morning, you see it on the side of one of those important words for our study of Meno in future videos, perhaps. Paradox. Because a paradox would be that coincidence of the ball rolling in parallel to where it could have been and what it might have been doing towards those pins. But now all it can do is be next to. It can never participate with the possibility of a 7-10 split spare. All it has, oh man, to me, that's far more fearsome a story than fire, fire. Let's leave the opera house. There's fire. Even though it evokes what may be underneath that story of someone yelling fire in an opera house. One last thing on that, I think we're tracking. Perhaps now we can go beyond that image of the bowling lane to other things synoptically. What you said about the leap up, I think that's great. Rather than a leap forward, how about a leap up, Matthew? I like it, Daniel. From the particular up, rather than from the universal down. And I think of Immanuel Kant. He is important to me, not directly, but indirectly, because I am one of those people who buy the bill of goods for him. Why read Immanuel Kant? Because he's the turn from a whatever was before epistemology to this epistemological mooring that almost all ships are with without their knowing, which is a great irony. Which does something to our notion of movement. If we are primarily thinking beings, that tinctures like a windshield of a car. It's sort of a one-way vision of how we move and where we're going. You see what I'm trying to say? It does something to how we conceptualize and experience movement itself. So Kant talked about the categories, which he was bringing from Aristotle. And he asked a question, which if I was to rephrase the epistemological term in my own naive way, I would say that what Kant did, his move, was take Aristotle's categories, and instead of asking, all right, so what is a zebra? Let me begin. Has a position, okay, in time, okay, with parts, those predicates. Is the white of the zebra as coherent as the black stripe of the zebra? Can I take a few numbers of stripes out? And I think I'm talking about the zebra. I think I'm talking very deeply about the zebra. Those number of stripes, that's a different question than does it have stripes? So I'm affirming layers here, the number and the fact that it has stripes. Wow, I could probably go now out to how many turns of the Milky Way, and I could probably go back to number of how many orders of millions of years in the universe. I feel as if I have a great power here in seeing the universe. But then Kant said, why don't we just not bother with the stripe number and bother with the distance from star to star? Newton took care of that. He gave us a calculus by which we can see without seeing the world. Keep your head down, looking down from the mind to the paper where I can make these lines, and then look up every now and then to the cannon fire, and then look back down to verify, keeping the focus down. He, as it were, learned the habit from that. Oh, instead of worrying about those external entities, instead of worrying about entities, why don't I just ask, where do the categories come from? Where does position come from? Where does number come from? Obviously, they don't come from out there. I don't even know if there's a zebra out there. All I know is that I'm doing things with number, position, and time, which is exactly what Newton did with the supposed universe. But really, he's talking about different ratios of lines. All right, in the same way, why don't we just settle down into categories and find that they're coming from us? So all these things are actually projections of God knows what inside, out there. And then what remains is, all right, how do I for once see beyond my own seeing? And then you arrive at a version of mysticism, which seems to be a very perilous jungle for me. In fact, I think it's a wrong way to formulate the mystical. But when I say wrong, I don't know how to begin to, I don't think it's a gutter. It may be too much grease on the lane. I'm talking too much. But the main thing I want to say in summary is that movement of, instead of what's out there, to let's myopically focus on the categories. Now, with that said, oh, what am I going to say to him when we finally have our friendship? Well, what is a friendship? Well, friendship's this thing inside behind my eyes. And I need to look at my friend to verify that these categories I have, these cultural codes that I have are lining up. But my friend might be looking at me and saying, hey, Matt, look up. And I think the calculus kind of warped him, and I think initiated him into a habitual mode. So habit, I think, is related to this, but I haven't used your word institution yet. So maybe you want to continue.
Oh, and please never apologize for speaking too long. You speak so well, and that review of Kant there was magnificent.
So a few things come to mind. One, I think everything you were saying at the beginning on kind of metaphor, moving between metaphor, to me, that is something I like to call the meta language skill, which is the ability to move between different languages, different metaphors, which I actually think, especially if we grant me the phrase, the liminal web, these kind of spaces of all these different thinkers and whatever, that skill is utterly invaluable, because everyone has different languages to say different things that actually have a lot of similarity. But if they don't have the ability to move between the different language structures or language games, there is a lot of failure to advance or to understand one another that is arguably unnecessary. It's kind of like, in the same way that if you live in America and you wanted to speak to someone who's from China and you don't know Chinese, you need what? A translator, right? Well, meta language skill, the meta skill, and there's, I think, a number of meta skills, but this meta language skill is a kind of translation ability between intellectual paradigms or people's projects or work that without, there will be a lot of failure to understand one another. So I think it's a really critical thing. The other thing is what you're saying about multiple metaphors. In the same way that I think it's very important not to be a monotheorist, having a single theory of everything by which you understand. I like to talk about the polytheorist, someone who has different theories, different mental models. Likewise, you don't want to have a mono metaphor, a single metaphor, because that's going to trap you. And it's always very interesting, say in the Bible, where Jesus is a lamb, Jesus is a lily, Jesus is a, these different things, as if God can only be known through the movement between metaphors, not just the staying on one, as if the truth must be known in a place of destabilization. There's some sort of destabilization by which the truth is known. And to me, that speaks to a kind of dance. A dance is unstable, but that doesn't mean it is chaotic. Actually, the beauty is precisely thanks to the lack of stability and the unknown. And the movement, it's almost like the movement between metaphors is what collects the glimpsing of the truth, not just staying on one, but the movement between. In the same way that the dance isn't a single technique, but the movement between techniques, right? Likewise, it would seem that a lot of truth is the movement between categories, not merely the residing in a category. And the issue that can kind of happen, though, is if Kant's like, well, the only thing we can have certainty about is the categories of thought themselves, given Hume and all of that. Well, the issue is that seems like you could then have a movement between categories, but actually then it all becomes under the category of thinking, right? So it becomes a kind of false movement of categories that then can't gather up the truth. It can only gather up a self-reference. And in gathering up a self-reference, it then starts to eat itself, unfortunately. It becomes auto-cannibalistic, like a snake eating its own tail. The other thing I wanted to comment on, I really like the point you made on the parallel of the gutter with the bowling, because the gravest mistakes in life, if you grant me that, the gravest mistakes in life must seem like you're in the right direction, because otherwise you would change. Like if you knew you were going in the wrong direction, then you would see you were going in the wrong direction and change, right? And also I like it because of the reference you made to privation. There has to be something like friendship in the work association. Otherwise it wouldn't have any substance, right? It wouldn't have any being. So it has to have direction and parallel with the gutter, and yet it doesn't hit the pens, right? And if the pens equal, if the point of life is the good death or something, to have that life where at the end you said, I lived the good life, that's hitting the pens per se. Where going in the gutter is missing the, dying the good death because you lived a good death. You just died. But you're heading toward death, just like the person who's on the lane. You're heading toward it, but you don't get the good death. And it's very critical. I think, Kierkegaard has that notion that Walker Percy picks on, where the man who's in despair doesn't even know they're in despair, right? Because if you knew you were in despair, he's like, that's great. You're in despair. That's step one, right? And so then the question becomes, this is what's very interesting. How do you apprehend if you're in the gutter or on the lane? How do you apprehend if you're moving between metaphors or between things and gathering up some sort of truth, which I know is a loaded term, but if you gather, as opposed to simply moving within a self-enclosure? Like in Kant, there's arguably a movement between categories, but there's not a real movement because it's all within categories of thought. It's not between thought, world, relation, friend, ergo, emotion, or something else, right? There seems to be the gathering up. Now, to Kant's defense, I do think he's arguably even misread by Hegel, who, I read a lot, because Kant, I think, always has to be read with the second and third critique in mind. And in the third critique, it does seem to be for him that the experience of beauty, which suspends categorical thinking, gives you reason to believe that you can actually know a truth outside of yourself, because when you experience something beautiful, you apprehend it as beautiful, even if you can't understand why. And so there is in the critique of judgment, because judgment is like, if we know that's beautiful, then we can apprehend that's beautiful and judge it as beautiful, even if we don't exactly know how. And there's a true knowledge in that. And so, but then of course, the moment the beauty goes away, you're back into your categories. And then of course, for Hegel, that's not enough, because you also have to be able in your everyday life, not just be stuck in a self-enclosure or a self-reference of categories or different things like that. So I think it's fair on what you're saying is category, but it's interesting to think the movement, the ability to move between categories, move between metaphors. This seems to be a gathering up of a kind of truth. And then the question is, how do you apprehend when you're engaged in that movement or not?
I have 9 minutes before we'll have to start another video because I don't have the upgraded version, but that's all right. It could be a chapter in our dialogue.
Yes.
You said gathering up. You have the spiral upward. And then what I heard as I was reading something about screenplays, and they said what you'll find in most scenes is the backbone of and, but, therefore. So you're walking along the park and you have a dog, but another dog comes and chews the back right leg of the dog, chewing it, blood's coming out, chewing it. Therefore, what would you do? Right? That's quite a thing. That's quite a grotesque surprise walk down Manhattan with your dog. Where was I going with this? The but that I would insert, which I think was already in what you said, is as one gathers up, we must remember to take ourselves with us, so that we may be where the good is. Something St. Dionysius the Areopagite said, the good of all is present to all, but we may not always be present to it.
Mm.
And that not as an ontological speed limit, but as a failure on some part of ours that can be rectified. So thank God for time. Now, what does it mean as we begin to talk about this gathering up, which I want to hold on to? And especially because it relates in my mind gradually to the weights and measures of that leap up, that movement up, that elevation up from a particular, which then you said afterwards, you come back down, or you go up and then you can't have it as it is now because you're in the next. However, religiously, I think we can affirm the apprehension that it carries forward. And yet we have this experience of loss sometimes. Perhaps with the next part of this video, the next chapter, we could look into some examples, some principles, maybe even illustrations from Hegel, or that one example from Kant where he adds 2 and 3 to make 5. I think is one illustration in the Critique of Pure Reason. I'm joking. Or that man along the road that the Good Samaritan helped, which, by the way, thank you for bringing up that example, because it has that longitudinal part of the metaphor. Walking along the road, the 2 sides, those Pharisees, they were in the gutter and they didn't know it. Their despair was unacknowledged. And then your word of apprehending. How do we know when we are apprehending? And is there a delay? Is there a necessary delay? Is there a faithful delay? Mm. So one thing I could bring up as an illustration is today I was thinking, because it was in the appointed reading that I follow, the part where the disciples and Jesus cross a river. I don't remember which gospel, the Gospel of Matthew. And when they're on the other side, the disciples say, hey, Daniel, I forgot the bread. And Jesus says, beware. Is this a non sequitur? Is this apropos of nothing? Is this apropos of everything? It's what's going on here. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And then there was a period, and the appointed passage ended. Well, I'm curious, so I looked down the paragraph and saw that he was referring to the doctrine of the Pharisees. But my curiosity got the better of me, and the dog chased its tail, and I went to the Greek word for teaching and found that it's in it's this feminine generative singular, which I don't know all that means to parse it out in grammar, but I would assume partly what it means is it's the idea behind it. There are some concepts behind it, some categories behind it. There's a generating forth. There's a unfolding information, which I think we could talk about, because that to me is a paradox. Information is informed. There it is, the line of soldiers, but it's unfolding. And you'd think there would be loss. Because when you unfold something, you're kind of ruining it, aren't you? Someone took the time to fold that towel, and now you're unfolding it. So we know what happens next. It's going to be ruined, and we have to clean it and then fold it. Well, what happens when you unfold information? Is there a gain or loss, or is it both, and therefore paradoxical? Kant talks about antinomies. I think that's your version of him moving conceptually around his metaphors but not having those other ingredients to make it a paradoxical motion, right? So he has antinomies, he doesn't have paradox. But when he brings in beauty, he gets beyond himself. He gets beyond his appetite for this sort of knowing, hammering of the nail. And the last part of that river crossing, beware the leaven of the Pharisees. And in the Greek, leaven has this idea of, again, generation, but fermentation, yeast, right? That makes the bread go up. So then I flip back, this is going somewhere, to Exodus. They're leaving Egypt, and God says, remember this day. Don't have any leaven with you for 7 days, and on the seventh day have a feast to the Lord. But then he goes on. Is he saying the same thing, or is he adding to it? Is it leaven of the prohibition against leaven? Right now, that was a metaphorical jump. What does it mean to elaborate? Does it mean to add the yeast to an argument? Okay, so he's doing it while saying don't have it on different levels. Let there be no yeast among your regions. Is he saying the same thing, or is he adding to it? And if he's adding to it, he's telling us all in the context of what we should have subtracted. Why? So that the memory may be on your hand, before your eyes, which I think that also could be a temporal before. Before you see, and that the law would be in your mouth. What poetically is going on here? Why can't the law just be right here? So I could refer to it. And if it's not there so I could refer to it, why is it in a book? Why was it spoken to me? What is he asking me to do here? Isn't it just about leaven? Okay, back to the gospel, a few pages forward. He's bringing up the fact that they should beware. They should be very afraid of the leaven of the Pharisees. They're teaching the thing that makes a lot of yeast in their region. He's saying it after they said to him, there's no bread here. So they're introducing, or the author is introducing, this setup. Here's an absence, no bread. To which Jesus says, there is an absent presence here, or a present absence here, that I would rather talk about through the bread. Absence, which is, even though you can't see it and don't think it's with you, there is a teaching of the Pharisees that you have inside you that's growing. Let's beware of letting that grow. That to me is the whole Kantian categorical imperative growth, just looking at the conceptual frame and not. I have to now stop the video because I have less than a minute, but now you are up after this, okay? I'll send you another,
sir.
my friend.
Please take your time.